Thanks so much for this. What a great group of people to gather on. It's Sabbath afternoon for me. I'm sure it's different times for people in different places, but what a lovely way to spend Sabbath together. Um, and yeah, I do spend most of my time. I There's a lot of great online communities that I don't get to be part of, like this one, because I am deeply entrenched in my own local church, and it literally takes all of my churchy time is spent with my local iteration of my church, and so any time is time away from that. We have been part of a church. I grew up in a church plant. My dad helped plant a church. He was a pastor, um, and took kind of a leave from the paid ministry to help plant a church in West Virginia 50 years ago. And so I grew up kind of with that idea, and I very much enjoyed being part of a small and kind of, I think, punching above our weight size-wise congregation. And my thoughts today come out of being a teacher, and a teacher who is a product of our Seventh-day Adventist school system. I already said I was a pastor's child. My mom converted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church through something that some of you might remember, but I feel like I have to define for anyone my age and younger, which is something called branch Sabbath school. So I don't know if any of you out there are familiar with that concept, but it was something that I don't know if it still happens in some places. I don't hear about it anymore, where people went and started a Sabbath school, kind of like precursor to a church plant, I guess, for kids. And that is sort of like the beginning of a church. And so there was an Adventist family in her town, in a little town in Oregon in the Wallowa Valley, who took her and her brothers to church, to Branch Sabbath School, and then to Pathfinders. And she became a Seventh-day Adventist as an early teen, that way, and then eventually went to Walla Walla College. So my dad had grown up multiple generations in the church. My mom had not been that church going before she became a Seventh-day Adventist. And they very much believed in what we might call child evangelism or youth evangelism in our school system. And so I went all the way through Southern Adventist University with my bachelor's degree before I went to graduate school, not in an Adventist university, for the first time, and then came back 6 years later to teach at Southern. So I have been very much an institutional, uh, in the North American division anyway, the way our institutions are set up. I'm very much part of that institutional Adventism and our church systems, and also our church school systems as our mechanism, many ways, for child evangelism and for passing on our faith to the next generation. And there's multiple ways that we could do that. Lots of other churches that don't have a school system have other ways, other denominations of passing along their faith. But we have invested a lot in those institutions, and that's part of what I do. And I think about that in my role as a professor, that part of what I'm doing is mentoring people into a tradition, and setting kind of one way of doing that through higher education, which is not the only way to be a Christian or a Seventh-day Adventist, but is one way of doing that. So I am a person who belongs to a very large family, and I care a lot about families. And my talk today is going to come a little bit out of my research, and then maybe secondarily about how we can do some of these same kinds of things in our church, in our denomination, or what we might not should do, like things that we shouldn't be doing, perhaps. And we can have a good conversation about that. And I welcome kind of your thoughts. I am not a researcher of sociology or like current church attitudes. I've not done any surveys of my students, really. Anything that I might say about young adults in our Seventh-day Adventist school system is completely anecdotal and not at all intended to be like scholarly. I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of the 17th century. So you can decide how relevant you think that is after my talk. But I started researching religious toleration in my dissertation 20 years ago, and I looked at the development of religious toleration in England in the late 17th century and the persecuted religious minority in England in the 17th century were Roman Catholics. So my dissertation was on Roman Catholic attempts to make the case to be considered full citizens of England and to be tolerated. So that I did that. I did that kind of thing, that sort of intellectual history, state church kinds of things, political history for the first part of my uh, professional life. But I started realizing that things could be more interesting if they got a little more personal in terms of research and making connections. And families have always interested me. I have some writing I'm working on, and I've done several sermon series on Jesus's family, his family, and that's super interesting to me, his family, earthly family, you might say, and how he handled them. And I started deciding I wanted to look at Catholic families in the 17th century. So I'm just going to say a little bit about that. Catholics in the 17th century were a persecuted minority. Their faith was outlawed by the state that they were part of, and they wanted to pass their faith along to their children. And so things that they were battling, what they were up against as they wanted to do this, were actual laws that made it hard for them to practice their faith. Okay. They weren't allowed to receive communion in the way that they thought communion should be given. The Eucharist is kind of how they referred to it. The Mass is how it's said in English a lot. And a priest could be executed for being caught giving communion in the Catholic manner, and they were not unrelentingly in the 17th century, but from time to time. How many people do you have to execute? How many priests do you have to execute to establish a series of fear? This is a violent metaphor I'm about to make here, but I tell my students sometimes you don't have to lynch that many Black men in the US and the South to create an atmosphere of terror and fear. And you don't have to execute that many Catholic priests before everybody recognizes this is a life-threatening thing to give communion in England in your own kind. And communion is the core act of the Christian community, right? It's the core thing that we do, that we come together and we take communion with each other. This is the thing that we do that makes us the church. And you don't take communion by yourself. You take it in community with other people. Most of our other acts of Christian faith can be sort of done on our own, but that is not something we do on our own. There were limits on holding office if you were a Catholic. There were oaths that you had to take in order to hold office that basically said, I abjure the Pope from any power, and often required you to say that you did not believe in the living presence of God in the bread and the wine of communion, which we're very specifically put in oaths for public office to prevent Catholics from holding any public office. There were laws against educating their children in Catholic schools or in a Catholic manner. And then there were lots and lots and lots and lots of fines. So it doesn't appear, I mean, the English state seems to have wanted to have gotten rid of Catholics by making life really hard for them. They did get hanged, drawn, and quartered occasionally, but mostly they wanted attrition for them. Like they didn't want to have to be like killing a whole bunch of them, or like under Queen Mary in the 16th century when Protestants had been burned. They didn't want to do that, so they wanted it to make it harder and harder for them to be Catholic, and then eventually they would just go away. That was their main way. And one of the things that they benefited from their being Catholics was by being able to fine them. Anyone who had any property or any wealth had to pay such heavy fines if they recused themselves from church and didn't go to the Protestant church, that it was a major source of income for the state. Um, so lots of fines against their property. So they're battling, this is the first thing they're battling, is that they are outlawed, this minority. And I will just say this, Catholics were about 5% in the 17th century. They were about 5%. At most, in some place, maybe 10% of the overall English population. So they're battling that. They're also battling things like capitalism which is emerging as an idea in the 17th century. The desire to accumulate property, to get professional jobs that are kind of more bureaucratic jobs. The idea that you need more professionalism, so you need education for that. And their lack of ability to go to the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, the main universities in England, or if they did not take communion in the Protestant church, their inability to inherit had always kind of been a problem, but it's increasingly a problem in the 17th century. And anyone who wants to be part of this economy now, this is the era of they're developing joint stock companies. There's greater commercial options in the Atlantic and Pacific and Indian Ocean, and the disabilities for being Catholic seem to be greater at this time. Being a doctor, a lawyer, any of the other professions, things like accountants or clerks, could be challenging if you couldn't go to university in England. And again, this is the era of expansionism when people are being more part of that. It's difficult to create international merchant connections if your state is consistently surveilling you and preventing you from traveling effectively and things like that. So, all of the things that go along with monetary expansion in the 17th century, with making more money, are restricted for Catholics. And this is challenging. Um, so this is the third element that made it hard for Catholics was their increasing association with superstition. So they're increasingly called superstitious and they're being labeled as backward. Protestants used to say that they were the persecutors and that they were the Antichrist. But in the 17th century, now they're more and more, they're trying to say, they're too religious, they're too into their images, they like miracles too much, and they don't appreciate freedom or thinking for themselves. And so people with political disabilities, their beliefs about the Pope and the Pope's role as head of the church were also kind of just seen as being people that don't really like freedom. And increasingly, rights are really important in the 17th century to Englishmen and women. And it looked like they weren't sure if Catholics would be good trustees of those rights. Also, in the end of the 17th century, finally, the last thing that kind of made it hard for them to pass their faith on to their children, what they're up against when they do this, is increasing atheism. This is 17th century is probably the first time we start seeing atheists, and a lack of concern for Christian identity. Deism is on the rise. And again, expansion in the New World meant there's lots of places you could go where there's no churches, there's no thick church community. You might be a Christian, but you're not really practicing your faith or getting communion or doing any of the things that Christians had traditionally done as part of worship. So Christian community and practice were easily avoided, and you could just kind of fall into what we might call practical atheism. So this is also a challenge for this religious minority that are trying to pass their faith along. So when I look at this, I think there's some similarities for people today who are trying to pass their faith along to their children, who are thinking about the generations, like what it might mean to pass your faith along. We may not live in places where we have laws against the practice of our faith in the way that the Catholics did, but we can kind of feel like some people may feel that there's increasingly challenges to practice faith in the way that we want. Materialism, economic expansion, the desire to be part of the larger commercial community can get in the way of what it feels like to pass our faith along. And also, I think things like being considered to be, being super religious, being seen as like maybe not rational, or, maybe you're not smart enough, or how much into transcendence do you want to get, or do we really believe in miracles? There can be vibes in various parts of the world and in our culture that make that seem like for our children, is that something they're willing to take on? Right? So, as I'm looking at what this small minority group did in the 17th century, I'm also looking at what they actually tried to do in order to pass their faith along. And one very big thing they did, which rings true for my tradition, is that they created schools. Now, schools in England were illegal, Catholic schools, but they still ran them anyway. And if the authorities came in, they had to disband them and send them home. And sometimes there was someone who was arrested and imprisoned if there was a priest running the school. But a lot of them, if they were small enough, could function under the radar a little bit. Um, and so they did that in homes, especially people who were more wealthy. There was a small minority of Catholic gentry, is the word we use for them, who had like manor houses and extra wealth, and they would often sort of like fund some of these schools. But the big thing they did is fund English schools on the continent, boarding schools that their kids would go to in Europe, in Belgium, in France, in Portugal, in the Netherlands, in places where you could just cross the channel and get there pretty easily. And they have domestic and international schools. And a big reason they do this is because they want their kids to have in the school the practice of their faith that they couldn't really do at home. Because in these international schools, they could have a regular worship service, they could hear confession regularly, they could engage in the rituals of their faith tradition, which when it's just them and their family, they didn't have a larger experience of that. Also, parents sometimes didn't feel like they knew how to teach their kids about their religion. They're Catholic, but maybe they're not super theological. And so they want this for their kids. They want them to have this. And as I read about these boarding schools, so a lot of my research came out of looking at these boarding schools and the letters that parents and our children are writing to each other across the channel. Kids are going under the age of 10 sometimes to these schools, sometimes for a year or two, sometimes for 5 or 6. And they aren't, if you sent your kids to these schools, you could have them taken from you. If you were caught doing that, they could be taken from you and put in a Protestant home to be raised as Protestants. So we might use the language, you could lose custody of your children. That's not the language that they would use, but that's the language we might use in our world today if you did this. And yet people still did it, sent their children or took them across the channel to these boarding schools where they would be for several years at a time, often, or at least a year, with the idea that this would root them in their faith practice, introduce them to some of these rich, and they also, of course, were getting an education. And this is very interesting to me because I come from a tradition where boarding schools are very common. Or at least they have been up until the recent past, that people who wanted their children to be integrated into their faith and did not have the resources locally in terms of a school or a larger tradition would send them to a boarding school, hoping that they would get some of that connection and build their faith and be connected to those who'd gone before. Um, so often they would also try, so they built schools. That's the number one thing they did, or sent their kids to schools. But then they often had to like develop the financial resources for their kids and for the poorer people that were Catholic in order to send them to those schools or to offset the fines that they received or to help them build economic connections so they didn't feel like they had to convert in order to be part of the economy, the Protestant economy. So there's networks of Catholics supporting each other, providing education for each other's kids if need be, and trying to make even international merchant connections that are Catholic in order to kind of support that. They also develop a big apologetics campaign. So they're publishing things and writing things to put themselves in the best situation as possible. And that's a lot of what I had read in my dissertation. Every chance they get, they petition, they write, they tell stories about how they have been so loyal. They told the stories of persecuted Catholics. They develop political theories that make sense for them to participate. They're like, look, the Pope only has spiritual authority, not political authority. We're willing to sign any oaths that you have saying that. We're willing to take oaths saying we abjure any secular authority for the Pope. The English state wasn't willing to play ball with them on that. They wanted them to say the Pope had no authority, and they didn't feel like they could do that. And they told their history from a sympathetic point of view. And they got involved in local communal life as much as they could. So if they could find a way, what a lot of them did was the husband in a family would go have communion in the Church of England, in the Protestant church, and his wife would raise their children Catholic so that he could then become a justice of the peace or play a role on the town council. And everyone kind of knew that he was Catholic, but they kind of wink, wink, nod, nod if they like him enough. So lots of Catholics have Protestant family members that they have relationships with and that help kind of support them to be have civic participation. They try not to intermarry. They really want their children to marry other Catholics, but very frequently people fall in love with people outside of their faith tradition and they might convert. And so they regularly try to like even fight on the side of the kings in the civil wars to demonstrate that they're loyal to the monarchy. They fight for England in its wars with Spain and France, and then they'll say, "Look, we've been loyal." So they really try to make the case for for themselves and try to make it easier for their children to continue in their faith and be fully fledged members of society. All right. So I'm going to finish here with the Catholic part of things by maybe showing you something here since I was given permission to do this. This is a set of letters, and I'll just share my screen with you. Can you see my screen? No. So this is just a set of letters. You can just see here, this is what I'm reading in my research from a Catholic family in England. They have a whole bunch of their letters they kept for the last 350 years or so. And they are writing about their children who are on the continent, like making sure they have the money they need, giving them advice from afar, suggesting marriage partners. None of this was really easy for them to try to maintain their family relationships while they are doing this at a distance, which is the part I'm kind of interested in. And here's a picture of one of these schools. This is St. Omer's. This is in what's now the Netherlands. The school doesn't exist anymore because once Catholics were tolerated in England, they came back and set schools up in England for that were Catholic schools. But the chapel from the school is still there. So just kind of give you a sense of what was going on for them. Um, and but what I want to say is I thought I might make an assessment for you on how successful they were or they weren't. They weren't like in passing along their faith. So first of all, they are eventually allowed to practice their faith without danger of losing their life. The last Catholic is hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1681. So the laws don't go away that prevent them from sending their kids to be educated and from holding office or going to school. Those don't go away until the 1830s. But they are able at least to like start practicing their faith without fear of death. So their children may not feel quite as pressured to leave the church for that reason. They still remain really through the 20th century in England and the English speaking world. Catholics are still associated often with things like superstition and lack of interest in freedom and things like that. They did create really strong minority communities. Like a lot of kind of disadvantaged minority groups, they had really thick connections with each other between families. And because of the schools, like people who went to the schools all know each other and they're kind of intermarried and things like that. They did not grow in number, but they managed to maintain their numbers at about 5% of the population throughout the time that they were persecuted. And of course, they have successful missions outside of England in the rest of the world. And they're able to grow English speaking Catholicism in the rest of the world, but they maintain small numbers in England. So, my conclusion on this would be what what the Catholics did for themselves internally, it was useful internally. In other words, they created a strong community that found a way to maintain itself into the future, even though it didn't grow. And they weren't really able to change much externally in England, but they were able to create a thriving community for those who were already committed. The external world remained hostile and seductive to their children. And so they, in many ways, had to redefine success for their tradition. They had to speak about it in other ways. So, again, this has gotten me thinking, as I've already mentioned at the beginning, that I'm very involved in thinking about what it means to pass one's faith on to a next generation. I'm not a parent. I should just say that straight out. I chose not to become a parent. I do have 10 nieces and nephews. None of my nieces and nephews go to church regularly. So my pastor father, his 10 grandchildren are not very integrated into the church. And he has, with there's some exceptions, occasional church, there's not necessarily hostility towards churchiness. It's just not a big priority. And there might be some places where there is a little bit of hostility, but not particularly hostility to the Adventist church or anything. It's just not a priority for them. And I am very, very much a practicing Christian. The practice of faith is very important to me, and my tradition is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So I feel like I'm very Adventist in that sense, and I care about particular traditions, and I think it's useful to pass on one's faith in a particular tradition. I'm very influenced by a quote I heard once about 15 years ago, where someone said that to raise your children to be like spiritual, but not like a particular religion, is like trying to raise them to be lingual, but not teach them a particular language. Like I believe in sort of a particular tradition, and that for me, that's the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I care about that, and I want to pass that on to another generation. And so I'm sort of thinking here about how we do that. My church is full of people with children who do not attend Seventh-day Adventist schools. So I'm thinking about how do we mentor the next generation without like counting on it happening in our school system. And so one of the things I wanted to start here with this second part of my presentation, based on sort of like the case study that I'm looking at historically, that I'm pulling ideas from, is first of all, like why we even want to do this. Why should we want to do this to pass our faith down to the next generation? And why it makes sense. And there's scholarship on this. About 8 years ago, Lisa Miller wrote a book called The Spiritual Child. I don't know if anybody has read that, but it was profoundly influential on me. For her research, as a psychologist, a child psychologist, she herself is a practicing Jewish person, a person of Jewish faith. But she wanted to write it for people of all traditions and no traditions, because she was regularly running into people who were really good parents who really wanted to pass their faith on. I mean, make things as good for their kids as possible, but didn't want to inflict any kind of religious ideas on them. And so she kind of wrote this book about that, and like why that should why people should be doing this. So why we want to do this, in many ways, is because spirituality, Miller would argue, is vital for the young. And for her, she argued that this means it's twofold. One is you have a transcendent personal experience with a higher power or God, and you're part of a community, which is what we kind of call religion or religious stuff, things you do collectively as a community, right? It might be what we call religion. That children and youth need both of those things, their own personal experience and something where they're part of a community. And she argues that it needs to be across generations. She has something she refers to as the intergenerational nod, where across, grandparent level, parent and child level, there are connections and understandings that we kind of get. And so she says, and to do that, to be part of that community, you're going to be part of a particular community. She says that research is increasingly showing that we are hardwired for spiritual connection and spiritual experience. And she shows a whole bunch of research about the profound spiritual experience that very young children have. And argues that we should be taking that very seriously, their ability to have profound spiritual experiences. We are born with the need for transcendence. But it isn't just that it's hardwired in us and that it's biological that we need this, Miller argues. She says that this needs to be tended and nurtured by people that I'm going to call parents and grandparents. Again, I'm not a parent, but I'm including all of us in this, in the sense of like those generations that are the covering generations, is what I'm meaning when I say parental and grandparental generations. She has a whole bunch of research she gives on how participation in communal religious practices and having a personal experience of spiritual reality protect young people all the way through young adulthood from a lot of the mental illness and engagement in risky behavior that plagues them so often. She argues that spiritual connection and spiritual religious activity um, provide enhanced resilience for young people. A connection to something larger than oneself builds a powerful source of resilience and guidance. She said, of course, it gives greater meaning and purpose. It's the foundation for identity and confidence, helping children understand their place in the world. But obviously, she would argue too that just doing that, just being part of a spiritual community for those reasons, just because you want your kids to have resilience, is not going to do the trick. It's not just, you can't just do this for utilitarian purposes. She points out that allowing the spiritual experiences of children to shape parents and grandparents, again, I'm not saying biological parents and grandparents, I'm talking about the rest of us, can grow our sacred journeys, can tie us closer to God when we allow ourselves to be shaped and influenced by what is happening with our children. And we should acknowledge the way that children have a knowledge of God that we can learn from, those of us that are older, to actually take that seriously. The research shows that young people have a surge in what we call this spiritual quest during adolescence, around the age of 14-ish. And that continues all the way through the young adulthood. Um, and in that season, they aren't always as closely parented and may not even live at home during a lot of that time. In late adolescence and young adulthood, they may be gone. So it's very important that their spiritual relationships um, take their propensity that they had when they were really young for ritual and prayer into the next stage of life, right? So those of us that are older need to help children and young people develop insight and language that they can use around their spiritual practice. So they might feel it at a gut level, but they may not have the vocabulary or the insight of what is happening here that mentoring can help with. And so Miller suggests 7 practices. I'm just going to read through them. I commend the book to you. She's like, use the first chapter is speak. She said you should use spiritual language daily as older people in a young person's life, that you should share, you should be transparent about your spiritual experience and give voice to that, that you need to connect with them and meet them where they are, that you need to engage in teaching, which she calls building a spiritual practice together. So this is why we do what we do, giving the vocabulary to why we do what we do. Nurturing, of course, so embracing relationships. And then she has this phrase she calls tend the field of love, which is care and repair, like really out of that spiritual experience that we are really engaging in communities of love. And then the final thing we want to do is strive, which is to try to let them live inspired lives that are about something more than just what's going on with them all the time. So parents can build secure spaces infused with unconditional love and shared spiritual values that provide a spiritual home for their children. They model the spiritual values, they cultivate awareness. And basically we as spiritual mentors need to be engaging in spiritual conversation, being open and loving guides who participate in the spiritual dimension of life with our children. And I just want to say here, I'm going to pause here for a second at my end of kind of summarizing what Miller says about this, to talk about the fact that this can be awkward and harder than we think it should be. Okay. We say this, and if you're on this Sabbath seminar, you're a person who is prioritizing faith and spirituality and community, right? And even things like Sabbath practice and things like that. And so you're here for this. And yet, I bet if we have conversation afterwards, I would love to hear from some of you. How does it work? having these sorts of mentoring conversations with the next generation. Including young adults in this, like the university students and young professionals that I come in contact with regularly. It can feel awkward in conversation with adolescents and young adults. I find for myself, I'm not sure always when the right time to bring up spiritual things is. I'm trying to get to know someone, or I'm trying to find out about how their day went, and I want to demonstrate my own relevance, or God forbid, my cool factor, or whatever with them. So, how do I bond with them and also share my stories of how and why I'm walking the path of faith, what that looks like for me, why and what I'm doing because of my faith, without it being like in their face preachy and taking over every conversation, right? We're being told to do all these things, and yet it's a bit challenging to figure that out. I'm at least for me, and again, I'll be interested in hearing from the rest of you. Another thing I'm going to reference, which is not at all a scholarly book, is the book Soul Bloom by Rainn Wilson, who became famous as Dwight Schrute on The Office TV show, if any of you have ever seen that. And he's Baha'i faith, and he has written basically synthesizing a lot of social science research on faith and religious practice for a popular audience, along with his own story. And he talks about how vital particular religious traditions are. So he's not trying to get everyone to be Baha'i. He has a lot of things to say about mostly Christianity, but also Judaism and other religious traditions. But how particular religious traditions are so vital for getting young people to think beyond themselves and to connecting them to larger purpose. And we live in a world, he says, he's very honest about his own struggles with mental health, where a lot of mental health issues come from us navel gazing and only thinking kind of about ourselves, and that some of the unselfishness that Christianity teaches, that following Jesus teaches, and I can't say as much about other traditions, but I know that's true for them too, can alleviate some of the anxiety and depression that young people feel with, like, what's the point in any of this, and especially in a world where it feels like so many bad things are happening, it can sort of feel like we're not really being connected to a larger purpose. So he says we focus on ourselves as the main character, and that is something faith traditions can undo. So there are reasons, I think, that are emotional and social science related, that that mean that we want to pass our faith on to our children for their own good. Okay. But there are also, I think, historical realities, and what it means to be human, that make us want to pass our faith on to the next generation. Like, we are intended to build on what has gone before, even as maybe we do something slightly different with it and we're not totally bound by it. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. Like, we could maybe read scripture and come up with our own church. Every single person could do that, but that's exhausting to do in every generation. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Also, of course, we don't have to do things just because people did them in the past. But cultivating, and of course, a historian would say this, cultivating respect for the voice of the past is one of the healthy things that we can do. And even in the modern world, where we are just constantly about progress and ditching what people have done before and trying to do better. That's what modernity is all about. Even there, we still have this still small voice, I think, in the back of our minds and brains that says people in the past might have been on to something, and maybe we can benefit from that. And so when we pass our faith along, we understand ourselves to be part of a chain of people who've been following Jesus for a long time, have been trying to develop their faith for a long time. So I have a few thoughts on kind of how we might do this, how if you care about this, or if you think it's worth doing. Those are reasons why I think we feel that we should do it and that we know it's a good thing to do. And I want to say here that all too often for me, and maybe for some of you, our concern to pass our faith on ends up just looking like nostalgia Like we liked how we were raised and we liked how things were for us, or maybe we don't like how we were raised and we want to do something different, but we kind of want it to still end up with practices that we think are important right now. And we want that generation to kind of do the things we're doing and that we have done and that we think are important. And we like the idea that we'll know the same songs as other people. And there's if you were part of a tight church tradition, like in the Adventist church in the last 20, 30, up until the last 20 or 30 years, the Adventist church was a very insular, kind of tight tradition where we knew each other and read each other and didn't do a lot of things outside the church. You might have a sense of the rituals of faith that were meaningful to you and helped create what you believe in meaningful ways. And I do. There were things like Sabbath school and Bible studies and specific songs that we all shared, and Pathfinders and summer camp and agape feasts and ministries of music and ministries for the imprisoned and all sorts of things like that. And there were publications and institutions that was all part of what it meant to be part of the community. That was our context for spiritual growth. And I noticed when we started planting a church, and we had young families, some of us wanted to rely on those same things. With a few alterations, maybe. It felt really hard to reinvent the wheel and come up with new Sabbath school songs. Um, and so having a thriving next generation often looked like replicating the best of our own past experience. And when sometimes young parents, I'm teaching Sabbath school, but the young parents don't want to do what I want to do, um, you know, they don't know what we don't know what to replace it with. We're worried that if we don't have the same practices we've always engaged in, that then we're going to end up with lack of faith or lack of rootedness. So often our concerns to pass on our faith often just look like fear and worry, and we count the losses rather than celebrate the wins. And I want to try to steer us away from that kind of way of thinking where we just engage in either nostalgia or kind of constant fear. So we have to recognize that it's not going to be the same for each generation that goes forward, and yet that doesn't mean it's failure. No one today is as committed to particular institutions of any kind, religious and otherwise, as they were in the past. And we have such a mobile society that creating kind of tight communities over time is also very challenging. So this makes consistency hard. Um, but I'm just going to say for a couple of things to you all before we kind of open it up for conversation. Um, Allowing each generation to define success for itself. My dad always liked to quote from Hebrews, where it says that Noah was righteous in his generation. Every generation has its, kind of values, and, people doesn't mean those people in the past were better or more righteous than people now. It meant they were different. Um, but belonging to an actual community is vital to making this happen. And that community can be your extended family. Maybe you have people in your life that are younger than you that are around you that are family or extended family, and you're really investing in them. Fine. But for most of us who don't get to do that all of the time, we need to have an actual community where we're in touch with other people, potentially of different generations than we are, where we can come alongside and support a young adult or a child or an adolescent. And if you are in such a community, and if you aren't, like, kind of think about if you care about this at all. Maybe you don't, but if you do, find a way to find that community of, and even again, it might just be one other family or two where there's people that are of different generations than you, or might not be a family. It just might be a young adult who's moved into your area and that has some similar interests to you, or is showing up at a church or a Sabbath school that you're part of, if church is your community. But for the love of all that is good, please, if you are part of like something that we might call a church community, make friends with at least one of the kids or early teens or young adults at your church. This doesn't have to be as hard as you think it might be. And again, it matters that you have a relationship with the parents and that you're not some, odd bird that's just coming out and saying, "Can I talk to your kid?" You have to, do a little bit of the groundwork with parents first so they know and trust you. But doing something fun with a kid, and especially if you're able to do it with them, not with everybody else there. Maybe you go to their house and hang out with them there at their house if that's what's appropriate. I have middle-aged lady privilege, and I can go take kids out for bubble tea or ice cream. And as they get older, of course, young adults can make their own choices about whether they want to meet up with you for tea or for a walk or something like that. Um, and just investing just that time, just asking questions, listening to them, finding out what gives them joy. Um, they are hungry for adult attention and conversation. Showing up to their games or their performances. I've been to some very bad middle school band concerts. But this means a lot to kids to have someone show up for stuff that's happening in their life. This is not easy. I don't have children, so I'm not a parent. I'm not that kind of busy, but I have a lot going on in my life. I am not full of a ton of free time. So I understand this takes time. I know the sacrifice that this makes for people to do this. Um, you can invite them with you to things. If you invite other families along, again, you want to be appropriate for this. Sit beside them at a potluck if such things exist in your life, and they may not anymore. I recognize this. Young adults are really interested in mentoring. They don't always know who would be a good mentor for them. Um, so having someone come along and say, hey, I'd like to chat with you about this, I'd like to find out what's going on in your life. Discipleship is different for people who are actually uh, in, kind of your family of origin than it is for people outside of your family. And we need all of that diversity. Family members, if you're part of a family, or if you were a parent or grandparent, how much you crave other people loving and investing in your kids and young adults. Many people's reaction to their faith has to do with their parents, and having other people around who can provide wider visions of what following Jesus looks like is really good. We can't simply rely on our schools. Um, and so we have to be doing things ourselves. We have to be thinking about how to do this. And we need to take this on board in our own lives. There's a lot of alternative visions about what being a follower of Jesus might look like. And not everyone's going to do the same sort of spiritual mentoring. So practice your faith out loud. Um, with complexity. Talk about the challenges for yourself, maybe why you became a Christian, why you still showing up to church. Um, Tell stories. I think having kids and young people be engaged in doing oral histories of their local church or their church community. When I get asked to do baptism studies with early teens semi-frequently, more than I would have thought in my life, considering I'm not a pastor. And one of the things I ask them to do is to ask several people in their life, mostly family members, but some others, why they're a Christian or why they stayed in the faith. And even just having like letting them do the history of their local church, or finding out some things that have to do with wider Adventist community, is really good, because historical identity is a real part of like how you pass on your faith to other generations. And again, rooting kids' faith in supporting each other, in connection with each other, and demonstrating the ways that following Jesus allows you to make a direct difference in the world is also really important. So do what you can where you are, if you care about this and passing faith along. Now, as I end here, I will just say, um, it's possible that, again, it's not going to look, it is likely to not look like it looked for us growing up, what that sort of spiritual discipline and being committed to a church tradition or to Christianity looks like. And we have to have a belief in the capacity and of God and the graciousness of God, to make the church be the church in the next generation. What that will look like might be different than what it does for us. And God has not given us a spirit of fear. And perfect love casts out fear. So while I believe in particularity, and I would love for more of our young people to continue to build the Seventh-day Adventist church tradition, um, I have to say that, like with Deuteronomy 7:9 is my promise that I'm ending this part of the talk with, which is understand, therefore, maybe Moses wrote, that the Lord your God is indeed God, and he is the faithful God who keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations and lavishes his unfailing love on those who love him and obey his commands. And that is going to look widely different over those 1,000 generations. All right, Lauren, do you do
Uh,
the do you do the Q&A part?
I get it started,
Okay.
and I'm being the moderator for the group today. And yes, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm just overflowing with questions and comments, but I'm going to let Linda get started. Linda McZeal, you have the first chance to speak here, if you would be so kind. Uh, Linda, go ahead.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. As you were talking, I was thinking, um, your continence. That is so awesome. That was drawing me. And then I started paying attention to what you were saying later on. But you have a continence that is so compassionate. Your face is one where that invites a person like myself to sit down and hear what you say. Because I've heard a lot of stuff people said, and it was said with a continence that wasn't bonding. You talked about the bonding. You have a very, and I believe it's from the Holy Spirit that said that, because I'm looking at you now, you're not talking and you're smiling, but it invites. And I believe Jesus, that's what drew children to him, because it's drawing me, and I'm a fully grown adult, to want to have a, I mean, if I was in the same room with you, said church, or even at the mall or somewhere, or at the bus stop, I would want to sit down beside you and just have a conversation. And then I would be open to what you're saying, that bonding. I believe that bonding is so important, that the first person feels like you you want them in your presence. And then you started here, because like I said, I started listening to what you were saying later on, and what you were saying, I heard enough and I agree with it all. But I was looking at your face and I said, this woman has a very inviting persona. She's inviting. And I know that's from the Holy Spirit. And I just wanted to be the first one to tell you that, and to keep on. Well, and not just for children, because adults like myself, we need that too. And I heard you say it, all ages. We need that too. We need to feel like we belong, and it's not just a legalistic thing, but someone eyes light up. I read that somewhere, where I think it was in a novel, where when a person you like or love, your eyes involuntarily light up, and that you have that. So God bless you, and
Thank you.
continue with your work.
Thank you, Linda. That's the gift of affirmation is one of the most important things I think we can have with the next generation. I think with the body of Christ in general. I just got a new Sabbath school class of a bunch of fifth graders this morning, and the first thing I made them do was tell another person in the room something they appreciated about them, because I do think that spiritual bonding is so important, and the gift of affirmation is one of the best things we can do to model Jesus. And people wanted to hear what he had to say, partly because he communicated love. So thank you for loving me well, Linda, this morning. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Linda. Linda makes a very good point. How we present ourselves to others has a lot to do whether our faith is winsome or not, don't you think? Horace, Dr. Alexander, go ahead.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Lisa, for addressing an issue which is so important today with the Pew Research Center and other poll-taking agencies that indicate there's an erosion in support for Christianity in general, and that our second or next generation of young people are not necessarily subscribing to the beliefs of their elders. Now, Gone, I believe, are the days when a Sabbath school quarterly would stipulate what would be discussed in church, or when the 27 beliefs, or is it 28 beliefs of the Adventist Church would be purported from the pulpit, which would in effect corral the minds of our young people in a direction favorable to Adventism. Now young people have access to the internet where they can interact with gurus, with life coaches, with scholars of varied perspectives, some of them diametrically opposed to everything that we believe in or have been brought up to believe as Adventists. And so young people are no longer confined the way they were before in their exposure to ideas, spiritual ideas or religious ideas. I'm wondering whether the emphasis should not be rather on not helping our young people know what to think, but teaching them how to think so that they can navigate this very complicated world in which they find themselves, which we probably didn't have to deal with.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed. Yeah. No, I don't know if I have anything to kind of say to that, other than, um, I do think the curriculum we've spent tons of time and money developing, and that lots of people work very hard on. Um, for children's Sabbath school, like that can be very useful, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I just had some more traditional older family members in our church, because we just had this kid run. They gave a bunch of mini sermons. The early teens did, and did the music, and it was very touching and very inspiring to everybody, as it always is when the kids do stuff. They were very smart, really insightful, honest, and sincere kids, but they're not very rooted in all of the traditions and theology of our church. And so someone came up and said, we have a curriculum that can take you all the way through the Conflict of the Ages series for the 10-year-old, the teens. Maybe when our teen group gets a little bigger, we start having a more specific high school group, we can start running them through that curriculum. And, I thought, I'm not not sure that's going to fly, with the kids that I know. I mean, you try to be affirming and things like that. And it had worked for him in a different church situation, and maybe it would for ours. I don't want to be too discouraging, but it is hard when a lot of people have invested, and it does. I'm sure it does very well, kind of guide them all the way through. But whether it's seen as relevant to them, or they need to do it this way in kind of a more old school study way, I don't know for sure. It's this delicate balance, because sometimes we have this nostalgia, let's do it this way so it kind of looks more like they know the same things I know. Like, what if they don't know about Revelation 13? You know, will it be okay? Will they be okay? Will they be in their Adventist all their life and they can't talk about that? Will it be okay?
Thank you, Horace. Um, Ed, I think yes, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, Lisa.
Hi, Ed. Good to see you.
Nice to have you with us. I heard you say early in your presentation that a faith tradition can help carry a child through adolescence and on even into early adulthood and give them, I guess, some guidelines for living, uh, maybe some sort of anchor to the value system. But then that leaves us at early adulthood. And I think your statement tends to be true that it does carry some momentum through those developmental years. But then there comes a time, inevitably, where they start evaluating. And one of the things they'll evaluate is whether that tradition that carried them through developmental years is still right for them. And we see that played out big time in the Adventist church when early to mid 20s is a time of loss of many, many, many of our children. How important do you think it is that people stay with their original faith tradition? Maybe they get to their early 20s and they find that something else works better for them in terms of their spiritual life. Or they find something that doesn't have the things that bothered them about their early developmental years in their faith tradition. And that whole question interfaces with this whole Adventist notion of we have the truth. And so it's not only a matter of does a other faith tradition work better for me spiritually, or am I fearful I'll leave the truth and go to something that's error? How do you see that transition, say on the average in the early 20s to mid 20s, where they're starting to think for themselves about their own faith walk and how they want that to go?
Well, the research I was quoting from says that there is a spiritual surge that starts in early adolescence and lasts through young adult. And what they meant by that is the attunement to potentially transcendence. And it seems like somehow in our 20s, and we all might be a little aware of this, right? How many of us are full of transcendence in our lives? And how many of us can remember being younger and having more of those moments, singing Kumbaya around the campfire, great. I mean, that was the facts of the developmental research that they found that meant. And what Miller was arguing was that mentor, like kids need nurturing in that. And yes, once they're in late adolescence, young adulthood, they're not as being often as hands-on nurtured by their parents. They're often moving away from that, but hopefully you've given them insight and vocabulary they can keep doing. That's then you had two other kind of points are one is how important is it to stay in the same faith tradition? And then how does that relate to the Adventist tradition of saying, this is the the remnant message, the last day message. This is kind of, in many ways, sort of like the ultimate, final kind of development. I mean, you could read it that way. You can hear it. It feels like it's been presented that way. I think you can also read it differently. The present truth means it's always unfolding, and we're going to have to give up some of our cherished ideals. And so, therefore, there's going to be more things coming. Even in our own tradition, we say that. So, yeah, I think if people are raised to say we're Seventh-day Adventist Christians or whatever faith tradition, but let's say Adventist because that's us. And this is the best version of our faith, or this is the best practice, this best organization. This is the truth. This is if you want the most truth, you need to be here, and you train your kids that way. Maybe that's fine for them and they stay on with that and that works for them. Also, very frequently they will go, that isn't true for me and I'm old enough now and I have enough other resources. I'm gonna not believe that. So I don't think it's useful, to put it that way, to do that and for it to be, I think that feels a little bit like fear-based or kind of it doesn't allow for the complexity. I also do think though, I will just say this, most of the young people I come across in our tradition at my Seventh-day Adventist University don't think that necessarily and don't have hardly any notion of maybe why they should specifically stay Seventh-day Adventist. So we've done a really good job in the last 20 or 30 years in North America of undermining that sort of dogmatism in a lot of spaces. Not all of them, of course, but in a lot of like just your average people that are sending kids to my university. um, and so, yeah, there's still some that are like, this is what I want to be, and this is my tradition, but they're not usually saying it's because this is the only one way, or they often don't have a lot of sense of why they should even be Seventh-day Adventist. So I find I want to make the case for why Adventism is a boon in the world, why this is a tradition that God has worked through and is working through, that the emphases that we have within Christianity are things the world needs and can find useful, and that we have a history of doing these things. I find myself wanting to make the case for that, even though maybe I shouldn't say it out loud here. Maybe this is a problem, but I don't think you have to be a Seventh-day Adventist to be a good Christian. And my church tradition tells me you don't have to be a Christian to be part of the new heaven and the new earth. So in one sense, why would I be stressed out about anybody picking a different tradition or no tradition when I believe that God is the one that judges that? And yet, part of this whole purpose of talking about this is I do want them in my tradition for some reason. And some of the research tells me why I want them in my tradition, because a cross-generational tradition is stronger and healthier, and not having to reinvent the tradition every generation with in our case with just people who've converted to the church, but having people who build on and know about the evolution, and that yes, my parents, this is how they did it when they were young. But when you're born into the Seventh-day Adventist church, you have second or whatever generation it is privilege. People who convert in, I've noticed a lot, it takes them, at least in a local church, a while to feel like they could suggest that things be different. They feel like this is what I converted in and this is what it's supposed to look like. Whereas multiple generations across, we have some security. No one can tell me I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist. Like I own that. You can't tell me. Because I know, and I know that there's wider practices because I've seen them. So that's what generations do for that. And also I think can you join yes, of course you should join a different tradition if that's where you are finding God and flourishing most. But two things I would say. One is I think we aren't as good at human beings at persisting in difficulty as we should be, and creating communities that persist together even when there are challenges. And as a person who also cares about a little thing I like to call democracy, which should not matter more to me than the church does in the body of Christ, but sometimes emotionally feels like it does. I want people practicing staying in community with each other when they don't always agree or when they don't always like each other. And I think a church can be and sometimes I think our young people are like, I'm just going to cancel you. I don't like, I'm going to move away. If I get my feelings hurt, that's the end of it. And we've sometimes modeled that for them. So I worry about that. I wouldn't want that to be the reason that people leave and go to a different tradition. And also, I would say that another element of warning about leaving traditions is that sometimes we can, like, I remember hearing Brian McLaren once talk about that he wanted his tree that he planted to have deep roots in a particular tradition. And that sometimes people want to like dig up their tree and plant it over here. And then when they find out, because when you're new to a tradition, you don't know all of the stuff about it. It takes a while to figure that out. You're very, like, you might have listened to some TikToks on them or watched some YouTube videos, but do you really do you understand in the way that happens kind of when you're raised in something? And you can create a larger vocabulary, a thicker understanding to actually do some deep engagement and some deep work when you stay in the same tradition. Again, it's fine for me emotionally. I'm not raising children myself, but I feel it. I feel the emotional things when I'm like, oh, I'm sad that my friend is no longer part of my tradition. And why am I sad? They're fine. They're flourishing. This is not about their salvation, but why am I a little sad? And it's partly because I do think as a historian about generations and institutions and organizations of what humans do when they pass things on to the next generation. And I think there's value in that. So that may or may not do a good job of answering, but that's where I'm going to end it.
I'd say it did a good job. Lauren, if you'll permit me a brief follow-up. I think I heard you say that the students you're seeing coming to Southern have less dogmatism than previous generations. Did I interpret that correctly?
I mean, I can't say anything about previous generations. They are dogmatic. They're just not most of them, the vast majority of them, super Adventist. They're dogmatic about other things. They're dogmatic about random stuff, and they don't even really know that much about their own faith tradition, just in generally. They don't know, they didn't grow up memorizing the books of the Bible like I did. They're not biblically literate. They're not Adventist literate. They don't really know. They're just not. And a lot of it, even if they came from Adventist schools, is because they know about the love of Jesus. They care about the love of Jesus. They want to do good in the world. They're very sincere. And again, if I'm going to be completely like this is not a scientific study I've done or anything, but I would say that's true of about 70% of them.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Let me bounce off of what Ed asked here. I think the question that came to mind when you were giving a very comprehensive defense of building community is that a certain number of people, I'm anticipating what I see some of the people who have their hands up, and I'm anticipating what I think they're going to perhaps express in some way. And that is that some people of my generation invested so deeply in the Seventh Adventist Church, just put their whole heart and soul into it and felt not just committed to it, but in some ways uh, manipulated by it, controlled by it, and at a certain point began to be very disappointed in what they saw happening. I've talked to a number of people who said the day when they voted that women couldn't be ordained was a huge day in my life. I just realized I don't belong in this church. When I hear people rejecting my LGBTQ friends, when I see the sort of top-down struck things that the church is doing. And then another thing is that goes along with it. If you could say, yeah, but you've got your local church. Don't worry about those guys up there. But a lot of the local churches are struggling too, and they're not very welcoming. What do you say to those who just say, at a certain point, Lisa, it wasn't worth it for me anymore?
You want me to answer you and not wait for your friends that have their hands raised to say that?
Go
Um,
ahead. Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. I mean, I don't, I have not lived that experience, and I completely sympathize with that, where that sort of trauma, that investment, and again, it's about institutions, isn't it? And again, I study modernity. My students, I know there's a couple of people on here who've taken classes from me where they had to talk way more about modernity than they would have ever wanted to. Part of modernity, which is like bureaucratization, paper trails, finitude, institution. We are a 19th century church in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We are the uber modern bureaucratic institution with all of the horror that that does. And we might like love like the idea of a community that is not bureaucratized and that is more charismatic. But we have for the last 250 years primarily lived in institutions. And the middle 20th century was par excellence, the era of clubs and that sort of thing. And the Adventist church was totally that way. And institutional loyalty is just completely scattering now for everyone of all ages. And I don't think the idea of being loyal to a particular institution is useful or helpful. And I do think that because our church is so much like that and policy driven, and is so kind of universal in terms of like at the GC level and what happens. And of course, we've had very particular leadership over the last 15 years or so. It can feel even more like that. But I also don't know how else people organize themselves for something that lasts beyond them. Like if you have to, again, charismatically reinvent the church every generation, and like I just do house churches, or it takes a lot of energy, Lauren, to do what you're doing with the Sabbath seminar. Like what happens when you're not around to do that anymore, or you get tired or sick? Like it could be someone else steps in and it stays successful, or it doesn't. So often things that work are built kind of around one person, and there isn't just moving on down the line. So yeah, I think it's fair to say I invested too much in this. I don't have a good local church. And so then I have to think about, well, where are you standing in generations? Back to kind of my main point. What is the stream you're in, and what have you built on that others did before in the faith, however you want to define that? And what do you want to do for another generation? So whatever that is, whether that if that isn't the Seventh-day Adventist church for you and you can't do that, my appeal here is to try to do something for future generations. And since for most of us, we're not starting new schools or, some sort of new club or conference or band or whatever it might be, I think we're mostly going to do that at the individual level, which is kind of how I'm talking to everyone here. And what that looks like for you, you'll have to kind of pray with the Holy Spirit about that. So that's what I would say, is that I think whatever tradition you see that you're like, what could we build on? And I can tell this story to those who come before, even if it's a story of how I've had to think differently about my faith, and how I find a new community and how that works. That may be what a young person needs. So that's not a very good answer, but it's the one I have.
No, it's a Very adequate answer. Doug Myers, will you join the conversation? I think I've uh, opened your microphone here.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Uh, your my wife and I were thinking that your talk this morning might be pardon my saying so, a sleeper, but it was not.
I'm terrible at titles.
That's okay. Neither of us are parents in the traditional sense, but up until a few months ago, I guess I parented about a dozen and a half children, weekdays on a school bus, and and this last year, ages 3 to 5, roughly. Interesting experience, and a very important one. What your what your presentation reminded me of several things. Um, One of them was mentioned recently, and one of them could have been James Dobson, um, a in some ways horrific legacy. At the same time, James Dobson introduced me to someone who was absolutely instrumental in my life and in the life of my wife soon after we were married. Um, Larry Burkett. Larry Burkett was an amazing minister of finance in our lives. So I realized that some of the people that have a horrific legacy also did some good along the way. I recently finished a book called Betrayed, which reminded me of the horrors of our institutional religion, Adventism in particular. And not too many months ago, there was an article that reminded me of the horrors of institutional religion, albeit in World War II Germany, about how we pursued institutionalism over ethics and morality. And I struggle with remaining connected in any institutional way to Adventism. And the only way I can find to do that is the single church in North America. There's probably others that I am a member of because I can't find any others, and it's most of 1,000 miles away from where I live in Glendale, California. It's one that I think is ethical as well as appropriately religious. And so I struggle with that. And at the same time, you're absolutely right. Modernity has driven us to institutionalism for practical and proper profit producing reasons. And as a result of that, all of the ethical problems that have come up have now driven us, I think, to throw out the baby with the bathwater in my generation. Less so maybe in yours. And I would admire that. Um, the baby with the bathwater being cultural Adventism, at what point I can admire how I was raised and yet reject the things that created Betrayed and that created a James Dobson kind of thinking inside of Adventism and the World War II German church that acted so in a way that betrayed Adventism. Um, and yet you're right. We need connectedness. Um, Not Adventists, humans. We need connectedness. And without that, the result is exactly what we saw in Minneapolis. David Brooks, I think, said it very well on Friday. He connected it to its unconnectedness from any reason, according to what was left for us by the shooter, nihilistic and nihilism. No reason at all, just reasonless life. And the contrast to that is a book I just almost finished reading, What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry. it's one of the last chapters is relational hunger in the modern world. And if we don't find the right places to connect, we will find the wrong places to connect or no places at all. And in that early part of that chapter, Dr. Perry talks about being connected for a few days in New Zealand with the Maori indigenous people there. They invited him to their group, and it was just this big house, and there were lots of people there, and this is the way they did life. And that's true for many indigenous people, for First Nations in Canada and Native Americans in the US. And we have in our science made reductionism a part of our religion. We break it down and we break it down and we break it down into mental health and juvenile justice and all of these categories. And they didn't have those categories in the Maori tradition. They just had connectedness, community.
Sorry.
And so I realized that there's several things that I think you've connected with that are going on here. Number one is connectedness, connecting youngsters. And the statistic given by Dr. Perry I thought was astonishing. In 1790 in the United States, 63% of households consisted of 5 or more people. Less than 10% of the households in 1790 had 2 or fewer. In 2006, that was flipped almost directly. 63% had 2 or fewer, and less than 10% had more than 5. I don't think that means that we need to have huge houses with lots of family, but it does indicate our connectedness or lack of it, and finding ways to change that can be, but not always is, a part of a good religious heritage. And so I see us as financially wealthy in relative terms and incredibly, as Dr. Perry points out, impoverished in the United States, Americans, in terms of relational connectedness and relational health. And so I just affirm what you're saying, affirm what you're trying to do. And let me draw one more contrast. Of the 4 siblings in our group, in our family, my brother is not at all connected to Adventism. Doesn't have any interest other than his interest in me and my limited connection remaining. But he is very connected to 12-step programs. And we asked how people can maintain that kind of connectedness. It does not require institutionals because the 12-step program eschews connectedness with ABCs: attendance, buildings, and cash. Attendance, yes. Buildings, no. They don't own any buildings anywhere. And cash, they are completely volunteer. And so there is connectedness that does not depend on modernity and institutionalism for its connectedness. He goes to those, well, he's visited us from British Columbia. He's been to more of those in the last couple of weeks than I've been to church in the last 5 years. And so anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I hear that. I don't really have a lot to add to that, except that 12-step programs are people coming from their great need and their sense of great need. And we often don't like belonging to churches where everyone has a sense of great need. You get too many addicts and too many people who are socially not skilled and dysfunctional, and people will start not coming, people who are more slick, socially. And so we struggle allowing our churches to be the churches of the broken. And so, yeah, I agree with that.
Chris Widmer, you were at the top of the list and all of a sudden you were gone. And so I'm moving you up here back to where you were. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Lauren. I closed the window down here on my computer and I think it bumped me off or back or something. I wrote a couple of notes. Lauren asked me to bring up the topic, Lisa, of what I call and learned the term adverse religious experiences, which seem to be unavoidable. Working as a pastor for 33 years, like I did, even then, you do something inadvertently, your best of intentions go astray, and even heaven forbid you did the dark side. The dark side of you took over to try to, as pastors are asked to enforce the status quo in a church and kind of keep the seats filled, as was just said, keep the coffers full, keep the building in repair, etc. Um, I don't know. I wrote a whole list of stuff, but I'm not going to go back to my little notes there. But I won't go into the details. I could mention some stories, which I have here briefly in the past, but I know somebody who is not yet a year going through a divorce, and they went to church and heard a series of sermons on the importance of marriage and staying in your marriage pretty much at all costs. And that kind of felt like it was aimed directly at that person. And, they haven't been back. You never know what the adverse religious experience might be. From my experience, I find the church is all too willing to walk away from people. When I left pastoral ministry now 8 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been that long. I haven't really had much contact with my peers, people I worked side by side with for over those 30 years. They don't call me and say, "Hey, how are you doing these days? What's going on?" I'm like our previous speaker there, Doug. I'm very marginally connected to the church that I was raised in, educated in, and worked in. Because, well, everybody here knows I have a transgendered child, and the church is all too willing to let people walk away who don't make this don't support the status quo, I guess is the way to put it. And I don't know how to fix that. Neither of my kids are in the church. A bunch of my cousins raised in the church, no longer part of the church today, other than, yeah, they'll talk fondly of their Adventist roots and they might go back to a high school reunion or something to say hello to people. But many of them still believe in God. Had conversations with my kids. They still have a love for God. But church is something man-made. Church is a man-made response. It's a community. And when it's a tight-knit community, I guess my question would be, what can anybody do to help somebody survive that adverse religious experience?
Yeah, I probably am not the person to answer that because I think people with better psychological and social science knowledge would know about that. I think we're all much aware of the adverse experiences that people have in their life now and the trauma that they experience and how best to handle that. That certainly isn't like my point here is to talk about why everyone should stay a Seventh-day Adventist. I think my point was how valuable is it or not to hand a tradition down to the next generation? And if so, how do we do that? So I would think some of the comments that I saw around your original comment had to do kind of with the how, like my quick comment about like people are very quick to leave doesn't mean there's never a good reason to leave. And obviously local experiences, you walk in and who knows who it was that was preaching that day, but they were given the pulpit and they said something, and maybe that articulates the feel of the entire church. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it was, an elder who'd been given the opportunity to speak and hadn't been, vetted or whatever. Who knows? As somebody who has a very particular vibe they want to curate at their church, I know you cannot control everything everybody says. And so you can work really hard to kind of create a certain kind of community. And all it takes is one person coming in and saying something, and somebody who doesn't know how the flow of church structure works. And that can be something not even from the pulpit. It could be just something someone said in a Sabbath school, because apparently we don't screen people at the door and say you're only allowed to be in here if you have a certain level of spiritual maturity already, before we let them in. And I think I don't expect people to like stay in places. I have tons of people in my life who will not, who've been horribly hurt by a local church. And then there's, of course, people being hurt by employment and by the structure of the church, and then people who are devastated by the pronouncements of the official church. So I'm not here to say everyone should stay Seventh-day Adventist at all. I'm mostly here to kind of think about what it means to have a tradition that you hand on and how you might do that in healthy ways and why it might be valuable and important. Um, I know we have other people with their hands raised, so I don't want to go on too much about that because we may come back to some of these. But I do think looking at generations that got to benefit from a strong tradition and a strong culture of the mid 20th century and later 20th century, and have the privilege of then walking away from that and building on it or rejecting it or doing something different with it with all of the resources that a strong tradition provided them is very different from what our young people are doing today with no tradition at all. And the amount of mental health issues that we see, and that is a real challenge. And again, it doesn't, maybe the Adventist tradition isn't the right one for them, or it's a particular kind of Adventist tradition. Maybe the Christian tradition isn't even one that you want, because as soon as you expand it, whatever tradition you're part of, and this is something I get to say as a historian to my young people who want to be completely innocent. Young people want to be innocent. They do not want to take on, they don't want to be part of organizations that have done bad things. They want to reject anything that they're part of that has done bad things so that they can be innocent. And I tell them, you don't get to not have a history. You don't get to be, everyone comes from a particular community, maybe not a church community, but some kind of community, political, otherwise, that community and that history includes a ton of people who've done terrible things and will do terrible things to you. So it doesn't matter whether, you can reject this local church because of its expression, and rightly so, and maybe all Christianity because it's triggering in very many ways. And like I said, I'm not a psychologist or a counselor to help someone go through that. But I do know that not having any tradition or any sense of tradition is not good for our young people. And that they then, like, I have a colleague who used to say that you should raise your children to the right of where you want them to go. And his goal in saying that was like, give them a little bit more. Kids need a little dogma at 4 and 5 years old, but then let them, kind of move from that. Now, the trick is lots of people can't do that move or let that move happen. But I guess that's what I would sort of say is that this talk is only intended to sort of think about what is potential value in that. And again, it might not be for everyone. There may be you're like, my tradition is going to be we go on nature walks, or I come from a tradition of people who care about baking sourdough bread, and that's going to be the thing I hand on, whatever that is. But allowing our young people to feel part of something greater than them that extends in the past and might extend into the future is good for them. And thinking about how to do that in healthy ways is kind of what I'm interested in.
I love that injunction today and that encouragement. So that's absolutely amazing to recall. And I think the truth of that is that many of us are here because we don't have anywhere else to go. We're kind of on the margins and sideline people now. I think one thing that I think would say for many of us, I'll just speak for myself, we didn't leave quickly. Some of us left quietly, but we didn't leave quickly. There was one final supposedly straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It was kind of it wasn't the only event, it was the final event or the last event that nudged us over the line. For me, it nudged me out of pastoring into chaplaincy. It nudged me from being the preacher to being the non-attender. It nudged me in all those things, and I find myself here. And sooner or later, you just say, hey, this is where I am. God has led me here, and God is still with me. God is not the church, and you have to separate that in your mind. But having a tradition, I think, we did pass on those traditions to our kids. Our kids are good people, even though they don't. attend the Adventist church or do a bunch of the other things that we maybe tried to get them to do. They're their own people. And we went camping with them last weekend, as I wrote in a note, and had a great time together. And family time is a value that we did pass on to them.
And I think the research would say that a lot of their healthiness is because they were rooted in a community with some of those. And even their ability to reject that in healthy ways is part of having been part of something greater. That's what research would say anyway.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to move on now to Emmanuel.
Yes, Lisa, I appreciate greatly your presentation. In June 2014, Adventist Today published an article, Church Statistical Report, Weak Attendance. And in the 1980 Spectrum published an article, the higher a young Seventh-day Adventist go to Seventh-day Adventist University, the most likely this person will stay a Seventh-day Adventist. Question number one for you. After you went to Southern Adventist University, you went to the University of Chicago. Could I ask you what your parents did so well? Not only you are still a Seventh-day Adventist, but you work for the church. Question number two, what clue could you give us as parents that we are sure 20 years from now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church will not be a club for senior citizens?
I don't think anyone can guarantee that last thing, Emmanuel. I believe in contingencies of history. We do not know what the future holds, but I do believe God will be at work in 70 years from now, should the Lord tarry, or beyond that. Whether or not the church is full, a church full of old people is still a church full of the beloved children of God, because old people are the beloved children of God. They are not less valuable than young people. So I would like to say that, first of all, that sometimes we're condescending about churches with elderly people in them, and we should not be. I have a whole theory of what churches without children could be doing. If we believe that the church is for everyone, we need places for pedophiles to go to church. A church full of elderly people could be such a place. There are ministries for people in churches with no children. So I'll just put that out there. But I hear you. I hear your parents' heart. I am not a parent. So I was parented, I consider well, but you know what? There's 6 of us. Everyone had different parents. That's what they tell you, right? And every one of my siblings would have a different story to tell about parenting. I do think a couple of things that my parents did. One is, no matter where I went on my trajectory of faith, they never felt like I had gone too far or I had left something. They were always proud of me. They always affirmed me. My dad specifically, who was my, seminary trained, ordained minister father, so kind of represented the official church in that way. I tell people that, if you don't say, oh no, you've gone, even if they didn't agree with everything that I was believing or practicing, they never felt like I had, now you've gone too far. You've cut yourself off from that. They always lived out loud for us. And so they modeled the challenges of planting a church, the challenges of church. I mean, our best friends in our church they planted in the early 80s left with the Ford Brimsmead conflict. We knew about these kinds of things in the church. And so I think the fact that they started schools, they started medical clinics in West Virginia, they started churches. And so we knew that institutions are human made and they're invented. And so, they're not ordained from on high. So being able to kind of see that in action was helpful. But I think the biggest thing, if I was going to say, and this overlaps with what Chris was talking about in his notes, with the fact that we don't teach people how to do conflict resolution. We don't teach people. My parents were family ministries people in the church, and they raised us learning how to have difficult conversations with each other. We had massive conflict in our family, knockdown dragouts, and we had to talk it out, like, till we could love and hug each other, even if we didn't agree with each other. We learned how to confront each other in love in our family. We had family councils every week. And so those skills were ones they also believed in the church. And I think we don't know how to do those well enough in the church. But in our family now, so I will also take this opportunity to say my family is formed largely through adoption. And back to the conversation about small families and the communities that we don't have anymore because we live in homes with just two people maybe, or we don't know how to do that. And again, because I care about things like democracy, I want people, I think big families force people to learn how to share resources and talk about things and negotiate. And in a world where we're not doing that, I live in a house with just me and my husband, so I'm part of that. The church can be one of the places. Again, it is not the only place, nor am I saying everyone has to do it here, where we learn to like negotiate and have those things. Do we know how to have difficult conversations? Do we know how to disagree? We are in more and more, I think, in the world, we're saying, I'm going to cut off anyone I think is toxic. I'm just not going to do that. I need to do some self-care around this. I'm not going to engage with those people. And I am by no means saying that those kinds of language about self-care, about healthiness, about not investing too much, about knowing where your boundaries are is bad. I practice those. But I do think it limits us from the ability of staying in community across generations. When my dad has no more children, really, besides me, that are active in church, and he delights in us and loves us anyway, it helps, even if for people who've had bad church experiences, they don't necessarily it rings differently because of how he communicated our value to him. He's not afraid for us. I feel like the worst thing you can be is afraid for your children or for the next generation. Like that is not a compliment, to have someone be afraid for you. And so like just affirming that the God is working in their lives, they are flourishing, they are reflecting God in their own ways. As parents, to constantly affirm that in your kids, across the generations, the Lord will take care of the other things that they need, which may not be always membership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but might make that sort of something that they could see as being more possible if and when it's appropriate. Our family, three of my siblings were adopted through the foster care system at an older age. Our family became a family because we acted as a family. We had rituals that we did as a family. We constantly learned to be a family together and to keep showing up together. And again, conflict management and resolution was part of that. And I think that's the kind of thing that in my fantasy world, we would have churches that were better at that and would allow us to experience some of that larger community without it all being families that you procreate, that you practice being in community. But that it takes multiple people willing to do that. Paul says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, I think it's Paul, could be misquoting here, live at peace with all humans, which has several little things in there, caveats, right? It doesn't always depend on you. It is not always peaceful. But I think we're too quick to abandon the ship sometimes because we haven't been taught, nor have we created the structures for doing that. And we can do it in our families first.
Thank you.
I'm assuming George is next.
Yeah, I was waiting for Lauren to, okay, but I am unmuted. Well, thank you for your presentation. It's full of good stuff and difficult stuff. I want to focus on a couple only quickly, not taking more, not abusing the time that I was given. You talked about truth and how important the truth is in church and people, in religious people and all that. And I was thinking about the importance of parents being in charge of developing their kids' ability to handle truth and to think by themselves. And this has been a major problem. And in almost every, I attend a few Zoom classes like this on the weekends, and in almost everyone, every time there's a problem being raised of, oh yes, my children are not in church. I had 3 children, they're not in church, and all the same bad results. And one thing that parents need to do, and I'm a psychologist and have been involved in parenting for a long time. I have 3 children and 5 grandchildren anyways, is that I always believed what my dad taught me. We need to teach our kids to think by themselves. And that's a very serious and difficult task when people are sometimes religiously oriented in a way they don't want the kids to think by themselves. They want the kids to be just following that same pattern. I'm the 4th generation of Adventist, so you need to stay. And all this kind of stuff. This is baloney. Teaching our kids to think for themselves is one of the most, if not the most important task of parents. This is making them grow, maturing, becoming responsible and good citizens. And in this sense, we have a problem. Back to the truth. We need to tell them the truth. And this is a problem in the Adventist church because if we tell them all the truth about details of the history of the Adventist church and many things that we know now that when I was a teenager, I didn't know, was never taught as majority here. We were not taught about that stuff. We were the remnant church. And so I think that one important component of helping them to think by themselves is revealing them everything and let them make their own decisions. You see, the hiding technique doesn't work in the internet age anymore. Now everything is on the table. I did this with my children. We always talked openly about everything. Everything that I was learning after my 30s, because I got access to the truth, only after that. And by truth, I mean the things that the church was hiding. I was sharing with them. And I don't have any problem with them not being Adventist today, because if I had the information when I decided to be baptized around 17 or so, although I was in church since age 4. If I had known this at that time, all those things, I would never stayed in the Adventist church. Why? There are other churches that don't do this kind of thing to their members. They just have everything open, and yeah, they might have some different interpretations here and there, but they are not hiding things on purpose. So it's now it's a very confusing time for everyone. What to do? I still think that the best thing is put everything on the table, tell them everything, and say, hey, you have a brain given by God, you process these things, and you make your decision. Has nothing to do with my decision or the grandparents' decision or anything. You have to be honest with them if you don't want bad results over again. That's just my input in this area. Thank you.
Lisa, is it possible that a church that has made so much of it, of affirming a certain set of truths and having to believe them, that's actually become sort of a weak foundation as people begin to realize that maybe some of those that we're offering them aren't as true as they thought they were? Inspiration from God rather than from other authors or expectation.
Yes, I think that's true. And I mean, I think what is truth, what makes something true or not, how we define that is definitely going to matter. And I do think people can disagree, even within the Adventist church, about whether something is true or not true. Um, and our young people are going to come to different conclusions on that too. But we have the internet now. We're just not able to control the narrative.
Yeah.
So that's just facts. So
Yeah.
we'll keep debating about it. And of course, academics and people care about research.
Yeah.
Democratization of knowledge is a good thing. And also it means that it's really hard to develop any consensus around anything or like pass any kind of coherent knowledge on. So that's a bigger societal problem. But
Yeah.
yes, it's also true for us.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Art, would you please join the conversation?
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Lisa, for what you presented. There was a mention of the Adventist church being a 19th century church, and it truly is in so many ways. Unlike what is a pattern for a lot of people who they get out of school, they were raised in a conservative tradition, they get out of school, out of college, and sow their wild oats, and then they have children and come back. My wife and I never sowed our wild oats. We both graduated from the same college. We left when we had our first child. And we left because we did not want our children to be raised with the same standards that we were raised with or values that we were raised with. And not that everything that we were raised with was negative, it wasn't. But we didn't want to have them fixated on a fundamentalist view of scripture, a proof text theology. And we didn't want to raise our children with the idea that there was a cosmic figure out there who knows if they've been good or bad, knows if they're sleeping, reads your thoughts, and who will condemn you forever if you don't have the right thoughts. We wanted our children to be raised in a home where they knew they were loved no matter what they did or thought or loved. And so how are we really, well, is it a consistent message to teach our children that we love them unconditionally, but that there's someone looking over their shoulder, wanting to know exactly what they're thinking, what they're doing, if they make any mistakes, and that they will be, well, and to be fixated on the thing that I was fixated on as a child, and that was whether or not I would be lost. Whether or not Jesus would come when I had one unconfessed sin, and then that I would be lost forever, and that it wouldn't be enough for me to just be lost, that I would be burned for it. And Sister White teaches that. So we wanted our children to be raised in a community where they felt part of the community, and that can be done in the Adventist church. I realize that, but I've never felt that I was part of the community in which I lived, and still don't, because even though I haven't been part of the Adventist church for decades, uh, you know, I'm an odd duck, and I know that I am because of how I was raised. It seems to be a contradiction if we raise our children with the idea that we love them unconditionally, but that I think it's just, but then to tell them that on one hand, and then to tell them on the other hand that it is just and right and proper that Ted Bundy is going to heaven because he converted at the last minute before he was executed. But if they die without accepting Jesus into their heart, they will be lost. And it's not just enough for them to be lost. If they die before Jesus comes, they'll be brought back to life to make sure that they realize why they were lost and then to burn. I would never do that to my children. And it's hard for me to say, how can I tell my children on one hand that they're loved unconditionally, but on the other hand, I believe that this is just and right for this kind of thing to take place. That fits real well with the 19th century understanding of what the cosmos is all about. Now, I don't want to say that it can't be done to raise children in the Adventist church and to do so in a healthy and happy and reasonable way. But I'm concerned about it. And it wasn't something that we thought we could accomplish. And there have been references here to a mature faith, and I'm curious about how should a mature faith express itself? How should it be demonstrated? And how do you pass that on to children? What is a mature faith? Well, I think that's enough for me. I'd like to hear that expanded upon, just for my own understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Thank you, Art.
Yeah, I also don't think that's a consistent picture of love. It's definitely not my theology, um, and it wasn't the theology that was passed on to me and as my in my understanding. So I totally agree with that. That sounds like a horrible way to raise children. I will say that again, how you let your children know you love them unconditionally and allow them to experience unconditional love is a super hard thing in my observation for parents and families. Doesn't matter whether you raise them in the church or not. I mean, I think kids take on board things that they think their parents taught them or that were the culture around them and articulate them that I think don't reflect what I think their parents actually wanted to teach them and thought they were saying or communicating. It's interesting, you know, we don't always get to do that very well. And I see so many, again, my young people that I interact with, both in the church and out of the church, of course, the young adults are mostly at Southern, so they're mostly people who are raised in a church community, although not always terribly devout. And then the ones I'm running into everywhere, and that what I read about at my all my friends who are teaching at secular colleges, these young people do not feel valued and loved, and that they are, good, valuable human beings just as they are. They don't. And I think a ton of their parents wanted them to feel that way. But a lot of the intense affection that often we give, they still feel like they have to, the perfectionism, the striving, the feeling like that, it is tragic. And so again, church can be part of that mix, hopefully. I like to think the gospel as I understand it, where I need to experience forgiveness from other people because I do mess up. And that doesn't mean I'm cut off from anything. And I also need to forgive other people because human beings mess up. Um, that at my understanding of my faith tradition is that the fundamental posture of a Christian is one of confession, that I don't get it right all the time, and I don't believe that means I'm going to hell, and I don't believe that you have to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior to be part of the new heaven, the new earth. But I do think that that idea of allowing ourselves, and I see it so often, the intolerance for any mistakes on my part. I have to explain my whole life. I'm talking about the youthful tradition, the youthful culture that we have in the North American tradition anyway today, and that's on social media. That if I that to say I've messed up in any way is like it's almost intolerable. It's part of the shame spirals that we go through, like the ability to just handle the fact that human beings mess up is really, really difficult. And I think some parents are getting it right, some communities are getting it right and doing it, and others are not. It doesn't seem to be related to church, not church. There are so many streams of young people feeling that they were told all these things that they had to live up to. And I genuinely think that a lot of the adults in their lives didn't mean to communicate that to them and that somehow they have that. So I'm still percolating on this as someone who's watching a lot of young people growing up with people who tried to communicate love. And I totally agree that that is the most vital thing you can communicate to someone. And if you can't do that in a church setting and you're a parent, you better get in a place where you can do it because that is your one job kind of, and so I totally support what you guys did with your kids, to help them feel loved.
Lisa, quick rejoinder, and that is one thing that makes me very negative about the Adventist Church is look at the way people are brought in through evangelistic series. It's through fear, sensationalism, and fear of going to hell and being lost. That's what and the great controversy, the scared to death theology that I talked about is found right there. Yeah, well, since I'm still unmuted, I'll say one other thing, and I fear for the church too. The church has this. The church has misled and lied to us in so many instances, and this whole business with the suppression of reclaiming the prophet just shows how unwilling they are to face the truth and to allow their parishioners, their congregants, to know the truth. That's sad. That's really sad.
Thank you, Art. Before I bring Dorothy on, She's going to be our last commenter. Let me just give you a little update of what's coming up next. I have, let me get to my calendar here. Next week, I know who's coming, and that is going to be Warren Trenchard. Warren's filling in. I already had originally had another young man, younger historian actually, uh, coming, and he's not going to be able to be here. But Warren is filling in, and this is going to be interesting. It's going to be a little bit at the junction of exegesis and church history, Adventist church history. And that is Warren is a professor emeritus from La Sierra. Warren makes the case that the story of the 10 bridesmaids was really, really important in developing the Adventist understanding of Jesus' return in all kinds of ways. And he's going to do an exegesis of that story. This is in Matthew 25. He's going to do an exegesis of that story and then explain how the early Seventh-day Adventists interpreted it. And they ended up with something that probably some of you have heard of, an interesting little bit in our history called the shut door doctrine. And that was part of one of the things that had to do with William Miller and the early Adventists, how they use that story. So this is fun. I like when we can see how biblical interpretation aligns um, with our history. And then on the 13th, um, Gina Jett is going to be speaking, and she's going to be drawing on her history of being a and state of health to talk about.
I just sent him a message saying we couldn't hear him. Maybe Dorothy, you should give your question and he'll come back.
Sure, thanks. Hi, Lisa. And wow, what a position to be in, to be the last commenter of the evening. It's evening for me. I'm talking to you guys from Poland, and it's after 9:30 in the evening here. I am in an interesting situation because for many, many years, I just thought it was and maybe it was, I always say I'm like 96.5% sure that it was like my entire calling to pass on the faith, not only to my two children who I have now, but I am a teacher, and I had made it my dream, my goal for many, many years to open up the first Adventist primary school, elementary school in Poland, and we did that successfully. So that's how deeply I felt that I wanted to pass that on. And then I got totally burned by the institution. I went through a nasty divorce and just, began to deconstruct and did not think I would successfully pass on my faith, certainly not Adventism, to my children. And then my son just totally shocked us this summer, my oldest son, and out of nowhere at camp meeting decides he's getting baptized. And I always imagined that that was going to be like the most beautiful moment. And instead, my feelings were so mixed and I was so torn because I wanted to, be an influential person to lead him to Christ. But I had hoped that I would be able to do that outside of the Adventist church simply because baptism and membership go hand in hand. And I was explaining to him, like, this is not just a decision to give your life to Christ. When you get baptized in the Adventist church, it's so much more, right? And how to explain that to him in a way that he can grasp, in the future. So even though I don't attend church, somehow And I would give a huge credit here to the Pathfinder Club, which is just the best part of the Adventist Church in Poland that we have. Such great and safe programs by people who are just so devoted and sacrificing, hundreds and hundreds of hours being given by people for free. I'm sure that played a huge part of it. And Pathfinder Bible Experience, which we have done for the last 3 years. And that kind of creates just like a really safe community of peers, which I think my son just kind of like caught the wave and rode it on with the rest of his friends. So as a teacher, I teach English as a foreign language. Sometimes I work with the same children for even 6, 7, 8 years. And when I start with them, I'm able to kind of foresee the point I begin with them, and I know where I have to lead them. And I know like all of the little problems they're going to get in along the way with competitions, with exams, with their matriculation. And I know what I'm doing. I wish it was like that with faith and children. Right? Like we know in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition that they can run into issues with quote unquote spirit of prophecy, with investigative judgment, with creation versus evolution. Like there's all this stuff that, with like the fundamentalism, like Art was saying, with inspiration of scripture, like I could go on and on and on. And how to prepare them for that while, keeping that faith seed growing, protecting it, but like Art said, get them thinking, allow them to doubt, allow them to be critical. Um, just kind of keeping that spark alive and allowing them to be believers, but not necessarily Seventh-day Adventists, or even not be believers, but still be our beloved children, that's not contingent on our love. I just had my 25th alumni reunion at Blue Mountain Academy in April, and I'm the class agent, and I reached out to, my class members, and there were some class members who enthusiastically wanted to come back. Out of a class of 60, we had like a 25-person turnout, which is amazing. Blue Mountain Academy is incredibly fundamentalist, and there were crazy days when I was a student there. But there were some students that were like, they cannot put a foot on that campus. The trauma is so deep. Some of them pastors' kids, some of them children that their parents were staff members. They can't do that. And a lot of spirituality is unlearning certain things, forgiving, letting go. And I think that's one of also the things from my point of view, having a 10 and a 12-year-old one just having freshly gotten baptized is like, how can I do this right? And realizing I'm going to make mistakes, and they're going to have to unlearn some things along the way. Yeah, mind blown. So I wanted to join this workshop, and just want to thank you for the discussion and everything tonight. Thanks.
Well, that's beautiful. That's like par excellence, kind of what we're exactly talking about. I totally get your nervousness. I have lots of friends that are in the same position where they're like, oh no. And even like becoming like my dad baptized my sister's now husband right before they got married. He'd not been a Christian at all, and started going to church with her in a local church in Florida, and then had studies with my dad, and then was baptized. And then because he was working in film, he took a job with an organization that you may have heard of, that he hadn't heard of, but they wanted to hire people in film production, called Amazing Facts. So he went out to Amazing Facts, and he called up my sister. They were engaged at the time. He goes, I feel like the people out here might be a little arrogant. Like they think Seventh-day Adventists are the remnant. And Sari was like, oh, yeah, we might not have told you everything. Like, it was sort of like, how much do you have to sign on to be part of a community, right? That's always what we're talking about. And the more fundamentalist you are, both if you're liberal and if you're conservative. If you're
Yeah.
fundamentalist, you're like, you have to sign up all of these things or else you can't be part of them at all, right? Which makes it hard to belong to any community whatsoever, because every community, we're going to mess up a little bit. I want to try so hard at my church not to, but I hurt people's feelings and people walk away offended because of something I said that maybe I did say it wrong and I was offensive, because hopefully I didn't know better, or maybe I was just being rude or self-centered or something. And so having that sort of thing, understanding that like how much do we have to like belong to, and also how much do we want, how much do they need to know before they take the step of being baptized into the community that they know? This is the community they know. It is actually their community, and this is real. What your child's experiencing is real. Even though it might be a minority of what's happening in the church, it is nonetheless real. And so what I feel like, I think Art asked something about what does a mature faith look like? I mean, I think part of what helped me mature my faith is being aware that the church, my dad always said the church is a big tent and there's all kinds of different people believing all sorts of different things in it, including very fundamentalist things that we learned out loud that my parents didn't agree necessarily with those. And then there were people that were even more liberal than my parents that believed things that they were like, we don't really like that idea. And yet we're all part of the same church. I think personally, and you can expect me to say this, is that I think history helps, which is when you know every tradition, whatever it is, religious or not religious, Adventist or whatever, has always had multiple streams. And all of those streams have always been there, growing, in conflict, not. And we can be rooted in various streams. And I think the comment about if our church is primarily made up of people who convert through revelation seminars, if we aren't able to pass down faith to generations that become more mature and are older, if we're always a first generation church, this makes it very hard to allow for that kind of complexity. And I think your kids can handle this, especially the older they get. They like these conversations. They like to know, oh, there's some people that struggle. Like some people, here's one of our principles of our church has to do with Sabbath keeping and Sabbath practice. What is the value of Sabbathing? What do we do here? What does that mean? What does that look like for different people? This tradition you're part, and there have always been people that kind of did things differently going back. And I would like to emphasize a particular stream of the history of our church that has to do with justice work and multiculturalism. And another thing, and I feel like I have to hammer this because we are all outraged at the lack of gender equality in our church. And yet our church is still one of the only Protestant denominations with any kind of membership and any kind of traditional Protestantism that regularly allows women to speak at 11 o'clock in their pulpits. Even though we're not ordaining them as we should, we still have way more. I mean, my friends that are academics and Kristen Kobes-Dumay with Jesus and John Wayne is a very dear personal friend of mine. We've been friends since 1996 when we roomed together in Notre Dame at a seminar. And she wrote, she came to my campus a few years ago and she told my students, like, your church is way ahead of everybody else on women. And my students don't think that, right? They think we're super, and we're not where we should be. And yet, if you look at the big picture, half of Christians in the United States are Roman Catholics. There's no women clergy there. Like who lets women, it's only been a minute. It's only, again, historian here, sorry, I'm getting off topic, but it's only been a second in human history that people have been saying crazy stuff like women are equal to men. In my lifetime, a married woman couldn't have her own bank account. In my lifetime, women couldn't go to Harvard. In my lifetime, right? My kids think,
Lisa, stop it. How old are you?
Yes,
Stop.
I'm in my 50s.
Stop it.
I'm in my 50s.
No.
So, I'm just saying the primitive brain that allows for us to think about things like equality. Let's not even forget all of the other stuff to do with gender and sexuality. We've only been doing this for a minute, and we do not have the tabs on our primitive brain to handle this kind of stuff yet. We're just figuring it out. So there's a little bit, again, the historian in me that says we have to have a little bit of understanding that we've got all this stuff in our primitive brain we're dealing with. And we want to move it forward. Of course we do. But let's have a little bit of like, when my friends learned about cultural appropriation, they were so angry at the local Thanksgiving elementary school where people were dressing up as Native Americans. And I was like, how long have you known about cultural appropriation? 2.5 years, maybe? Like, maybe these people haven't heard about stuff like that yet. Like, have just a tiny bit of understanding of what it takes to move people along the way. Just a minute. And I think Christian faith can be one of those things as someone who's clearly outed myself as a progressive in many ways, but I want people like people are part of a political tradition here in the United States. If you're a citizen here, you can go, I'm just going to leave this country and go somewhere else. And maybe you can find a better place to do that and they'll let you come. Great. But for most of us, if you're here in the United States like I am, we have political traditions that we can build on and call on and want that we want to emphasize. And we have political traditions in our history that we don't like and that are also there. They've all been there at the same time. And the same is true in our faith tradition, that we can choose to build on those things that we want to value. And I think history and the complexity of history lets us do that in honest ways with our kids, letting them know, and they may make the choice. I don't want to be a church where a ton of the people are like this and only a few are like this. That's fine. They can make that choice later, but it won't be like it was hidden from them in some way. And they're shocked when they go to a church that is different, or someone tells them when they're an adult, oh, by the way, all that stuff you learned in Pathfinders or at summer camp that you had these great experiences, that was not real or something like that. We want to let them have that complexity as they grow. And again, I think history is one way to do it.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I want to bring this to a close here. I will say this, Lisa. It helps a lot to feel generous about the church and to believe that it can be a broad church when you're in a college community with lots and lots of Adventists compared to being in, say, rural Nebraska.
Yeah.
Just so you know, I've been all of those places.